Let's talk about it. Hello, all those beautiful faces. How we doing? Stephanie checking in with another episode of Class Disruption. And today we're talking about equity. But before we get into it, I need you to smash that like button. If you're new here, I love your beautiful face. Welcome. Hit that subscribe button and that bell so you get notified every time I drop a video. And of course, share this video. That is the most important thing that you can do so we can spread the disruption all around the world. But let's get into today's video. Like I said, today we're going to be talking about equity. And now equity is one of these buzzwords, one of these words that we hear thrown around left and right. We're not quite sure exactly what it means. According to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, it means justice according to law or right, freedom from bias or favoritism. In other words, something is equitable if it is fair for everybody involved. And while that seems like a straightforward definition, it still seems we don't know what equity is. Another definition we have comes from Ibram X. Kendi, author of How to Be an Anti-Racist, a book that I read over the summer. I'm going to be doing a full video reviewing that book coming out shortly, but today I just wanted to go over how he uses the term equity, specifically within the racial context, but he expands it out to all different categories and intersectionalities. So he says, racial inequity is when two or more racial groups are not standing on approximately equal footing. And the example that he gives is with housing. So not all the racial groups have the same outcome in housing. 71% of white families live in owner-occupied homes compared to 45% of Latinx families and 41% of Black families. So there's an inequity in the number of white families versus the number of Black and Latinx families, and because they have different outcomes. And so to me, this is a very different definition of equity. One talking about freedom, justice from bias, and the other one explicitly claiming that to prove you are free from bias, you must have an equal outcome. Now, this is not to say that I don't see any issue in the disparity between home ownership, but if you bring that back to the root of how it's defining equity, I see a problem with that definition, and it doesn't actually get to the problem because the solution doesn't make sense. Like, do we really want equal outcomes in everything? And so equity is not this easy topic to understand what it means in this definition sense of the word, to the ways in which we're applying it to this socioeconomic and racial intersectional reality in which we live. And so we got this cartoon. So you're probably familiar with this cartoon with the boxes and the people standing on them, one showing this is when things are equal, everybody has the same box, and if you can see, cool. If you can't, oh well. Versus equity, making sure that people have what they need. So we truly have equal access to seeing the game. And I don't mind that picture. I think that it starts to get at some of these different ideas and these different nuance and create a conversation between this kind of dictionary definition versus this new emerging definition within this anti-racist framework. And yet we learn that apparently this is white supremacy at work. So somebody came up with this other series of pictures, and I was cool with this too. I don't think either one is necessarily perfect, but they're good for starting conversations and talking about the words and getting into those nuances and parsing them out. But then we learned that this too was problematic. So basically, we're back to not knowing anything more about equity than we may or may not have known before we tried to start learning more about equity. And not to mention the politicization of the term into these vastly different visions of America. But I came across a thread the other day on Twitter, and I thought it was really good for exploring this divide and getting past this politicization of language and digging deep into the actions and what we actually mean by equity, not in words, verbiage, and rhetoric that really just builds these walls because the words are so politicized. And looking at, okay, those words, great. What are the actions? What are the policies that we're actually putting forth? And I think that we're gonna find a lot of common ground. The other day I was on Twitter and I came across this thread right here, and I think it provides a lot of great opportunity to have a conversation on this topic. So we're gonna go through that thread, but I wanna preface that conversation with some thoughts on language and how I see it being used and processed across the political spectrum. I've always seen it as one of those major differences between what we consider the political left and the political right in America. And this can often lead to people on the left accusing people on the right of being heartless. And while I don't subscribe to these left-right designations within the traditional American political system, the way that I express myself, and I was accused the other day by somebody who I actually really care about and who knows how much love I have, and yet, the way they said I'm heartless, and I'm like I care deeply and I think deeply about these issues. And it just made me think I need to kind of shift the language that I'm using and create a narrative that appeals better to their emotions. People on the left prefer language that appeals to your emotions. It may not exactly align with reality, but it is your truth. It is the way that it makes you feel. Whereas people on the right prefer to stick to these more reason and statistical based arguments that are more reflective of reality, but don't hit upon that emotional narrative that really rings true with a lot of people. And so maybe that's why I chose to make this video today, because it's kind of reflective of something that I'm thinking a lot myself in my personal life, and just talk through it, maybe get some feedback from you guys out there. Let me know in those comments down below how you think about the way that language is used. What types of uses of language appeal to you? Are you one of those more you need that emotional narrative? Do you like the raw facts and the data that kind of seem cold and devoid of those things that make you seem human or have a heart? And I'm willing to bet once we parse it out beyond the language, we're gonna see that we actually do have a much more common vision of the world than the language might suggest on the surface. And I think the same can be said about the person who wrote this tweet, because we're going to go through it and we're going to see we have a lot of different ways of using language and interpreting the way that certain words are defined. But that road to this common vision is fraught with these language landmines that make us feel so far apart when I don't really think that we are at all. So that's the particular lens I want to take as we're going through this tweet. You're saying this and using this set of language. I'm saying that and using this set of language. But really, when we get beyond the language and we look at the actions and the policies that we're looking to put forth, we're right there with each other. And when we focus on that substance, we are in that window of reasonable debate that we need to push ourselves back into, man. We're falling out the sides here in America. I believe in you, America. I got my America pants on today because I believe in America. And we need to have more conversations like this. So without any further ado, let's look into these tweets and let's talk about it. I woke up this morning with equity on my mind. It is getting tossed around in so many educational spaces without any real grasp of what it looks like. Equity is about power. So first of all, right off the bat, you can see we're both having this sense of the word equity just being tossed around kind of willy-nilly. It sounds good. We want equity, but is it really being used properly? And then she comes in and she doesn't give this dictionary definition of power, and it isn't exactly like the Ibram Kendi definition, but it is about power. And I agree with the sentiment. I actually think a lot about power. And the thing about power is it has this duality to it. In the one sense, you can see power, you can feel power, you can see how it expresses itself in this work. But then there's this aspect of power that's intangible. It's all about the vibes. You can't put your finger on it, but you know it's there. It's in the air. And for me, I kind of think about this in the concept of dating. I used to do, a lot of internet dating on the apps and stuff. And I could know almost instantly if I was going to vibe with that person, if I was feeling that person or not. There was just a certain power that they would emit. And sometimes this person super attractive, dressed well, and sometimes this person was just in their work clothes and, average looking. And yeah, that tangible part counts. I mean, you can definitely help yourself out by dressing nice, by taking them out to a nice restaurant, but in the end, it's all about that vibe. I don't care if we're at the nicest place on the block. I don't care if you're wearing an Armani suit. If you don't got it, you don't got it. And if you do got it, we could have met at, a dark bar in some jeans impromptu one night. And I mean, shoot, if it was really all about the looks, I would not have nearly as much success as I have, man. It's all about those vibes, that power that you emit, that confidence with which you walk into the room. It's that intangible part of power that really is what defines power. And so I've gone off on a little tangent here about dating and all that. But I do want to keep this framework, this lens in mind as we're talking about power in the context of equity. Because in the one sense, there's definite ways in which it reveals itself in the world, but there's this intangible element of power too. All right, next, she says, equity is about power. Let me repeat, equity is about power. You got that? It is about power. It is an intentional and significant shift of power, influence, and resources to folks who are regularly marginalized. And so this is where my characterization of equity and how I would define it and the way that she defines it diverges. This model seems to frame it in this zero-sum game, which means that there's only a limited amount of power. And so for one group to get more power, another group has to give it up. Additionally, it seems to strip agency from folks who are regularly marginalized. If not explicitly, definitely implicitly. Because again, in this framework, they can only gain power if somebody's willing to give it up. So it's like they can't do anything unless this other group decides to give it up. And sure, that's true of physical, natural resources, right? There's only a limited amount of resources and we have to figure out how to divvy them up. If one person is hoarding them, then other people can't get them only if that person gives it up. And this really only occurs to the extent that there's rent-seeking behavior. And I talked about this a couple weeks ago in one of my other videos, but just to remind you what rent-seeking is and how it creates this unequal access, rent-seeking is an economic concept that occurs when an entity seeks to gain added wealth without any reciprocal contribution or productivity. Typically, it revolves around government-funded social services and social service programs. So you see, they get the government to give them a special program or a tax cut or some type of special access to them that makes it harder for other people. That's rent seeking, and that's really what makes this distribution of limited natural resources problematic. But on the other hand, she's talking about power and influence. And unlike natural resources, particularly when rent-seeking behaviors are happening, like that is a zero-sum game. But power and influence are not a zero-sum game. What I mean by that is you don't have to take power and influence away from one group to give another group more power and influence. I see this type of growth as limitless. It can happen at scale, in perpetuity, for vast amounts of people, for everybody. And this goes for a lot of different types of businesses too, right? You can either think of your sector of the market as one single pie, and that pie can be sliced up different ways, but in order for you to have a bigger slice, somebody has to have a smaller slice. On the other hand, you could think about your market as a kitchen, and you could bake as many pies as you want. And that's how I see this type of power and influence. We could all be in the kitchen. We could have mad ovens all over here. We could have like everybody can bake pies. And everybody can have pie. Everybody can have power and influence. It's about opening up that access. It's about getting rid of those rent-seeking behaviors that are only made possible by government. So in that sense, I think that we can only create more equity by intentional individual actions. We have to see the people that we interact on a daily basis as members of our team. People with whom we are going to win with, and not members of a rival team against who we have to play and only one of us can win. And making money is a team sport. But I want to keep going because while I think the framework of this tweet and of this idea of equity are really set up in this zero-sum framework that I don't agree with, and I would definitely consider the language to be politicized and very far to the left. But when we keep going and we dig deeper, we're gonna see that those calls to action are very much in line with at least the way that I view the world. And that's really what I was getting to with the preface to this conversation that we're having now. Is something that I talked about a couple months ago with India Huey, a principal in Indianapolis, Indiana. We kind of had this conversation about the whole thing about I don't see color versus if you don't see color, then you don't see who I am, and how we need to get past this language and stop just saying these phrases back and forth and say, okay, well, what does it actually look like? Because when we just sit here and fight and go back and forth, we fail to see the humanity in each other. We don't get anywhere, and we need to start re-recognizing each other on these different sides of the divide as human. We need to see the humanity in each other. I see the humanity in your beautiful face, and if you haven't smashed that like button yet, I need you to do that right now. But let's keep going on this thread. So we're right here in a school setting. That means, I think it's supposed to be those who have regularly maintained power actually release and let go of their power to other folks who are usually without significant power or influence. And so again, she's going with this zero-sum framework. I've already kind of addressed my issues with this, so I think we're just going to keep going on to the next one. Power in school settings always falls under the umbrella of whiteness. This means white, cis, hetero, male, able-bodied, neurotypical individuals and their perspective, ideas, and decisions are centered and deemed the norm. Whiteness. I don't know. My tan popping right now. Okay, but seriously, to me, this whole notion of whiteness is just so cringy. And I know some people are gonna say, oh, that's because of your white fragility, but I'm a history teacher. I'm not in any way trying to deny the impact on history and how it's created the distribution of power and wealth as it currently stands and how that may or may not have benefited me as a white woman. I just generally don't think it's a useful term. And the reason I don't think it's useful is the same reason that we ended the Jim Crow laws, the same reason that we had the civil rights struggle back in the 50s and the 60s and into the 70s. Being white, being male, being cis heterosexual, those are things that you are born with. There's nothing essential in those things that you're born with to the way that you act out in society. But again, I'm gonna accept the rhetoric. I'm gonna look past it because ultimately I think it has very little implications on what people often point to as the solution. Because you could say all these things and then you say your solution. I'm like, yeah, I'm down with that solution. Like, let's talk about it. So let's get on to the examples because this is where it gets good. And this is where we start to find that agreement, right? We gotta get past the language, get past the rhetoric, and let's talk about actions. Let's look at actions, not whiteness, actions. So here's an example. My school requires students put their camera on during Zoom sessions. That is not an equitable practice. So in my sessions, I think it's supposed to say, so in my sessions, students can have their camera on or off. I'm shifting power to the students. See, because once we start talking about examples, I'm basically fully on board with that. Really, it seems, and this is the way that I put it, we want to democratize our space and create equal access and equal opportunity, which is very different from that Ibram Kendi framework of we want to have equal outcome. And it's also very different from just being like, it's about power and somebody has to give it up. But again, when we look at the actual outcome of talking about, I give students the choice. I create that choice and I choose. And I don't think that she loses any power in this situation either, right? It's in this framework of like, oh, I have to give up my power so students can have more power. But she's going to use that like that intangible power. Remember I said power has this element that we can see. So on the one hand, what we see is the camera on or off. But the real power isn't in whether you're telling the kids they have the camera on or off. It's in how you create that space to either welcome that kid and give that kid opportunities to participate, whether it's they feel most comfortable with the camera on or they feel comfortable with the camera off. That's that teacher power, right? You see where I'm going with this, right? So much to agree on here. Let's look for those agreements and let's keep going.
Another example, curriculum and content provided by districts is extremely Eurocentric and whitewashed, making it inequitable. Teachers shift the power curriculum has by our pedagogy and content being taught from a very anti-racist, diverse, and inclusive lens.
Again, I might not use those same descriptors, or at least with the same definitions, right? I think, for example, our curriculum is very Eurocentric. I mean, especially my global, when I teach modern global. And so it's a lot like the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, and you know, a lot of this time period, this is when Europe really rises to power. And then that really informs our history as a country. So to me, it kind of makes sense that we're like Eurocentric. If you go to other countries, you know, they're teaching their country's history. And so it might be more, you know, Chinese based. And I might also use the term whitewashed, but not in the literal sense of it being, you know, whitewashed because it's so Eurocentric. It's whitewashed because it's a standardized textbook put out by some big corporation who, you know, wants to make sure that they're checking off all their lists and hitting all their standards and the scope and the sequence and all that. That's stuff that makes what we do such BS anyways. Like, let me teach, bro. But I'm looking past that because despite those differences in language, I basically agree. We should diversify the curriculum. Teachers should have the power to bring in things that are more responsive to their students' cultures and heritage. I mean, a lot of my students are from the Dominican Republic, and so it's not in my curriculum, but I bring in Churijo because he is, you know, an autocratic kind of dictator leader, and it's a reference that they know and understand on a very personal level without me having to be like, this is the definition of an authoritarian ruler or a dictator. Like, they get it. So then when I pull it over and I start to talk about some of the people who are actually in our curriculum, I'm miles ahead than if I had just started with some bland definition of a dictator. And you know me, I'm always talking about that teacher power. So I love that ultimately what she's looking for is individual teachers, just one classroom, one teacher in one classroom, putting in that work and making the lessons make sense for their students and not just going from this pre-packaged, whatever, Pearson BS that they give us. All right, we got one more example.
Last example, SWD, students with disability, and general ed are both constantly treated unfairly and unjustly in schools.
So basically everybody.
Making sure teachers are following all IEPs, offering full access to content, and not gatekeeping any students is how you shift power.
To me, this example is the weakest of the three. It's just so like broad and general, and I think that like teachers are already kind of doing this. It's not specific enough to take that teacher who like thinks that they're doing this, but maybe is not, you know, doing it with as much fidelity as they could be, to then being able to examine their practices to make that switch. I do think it really gets to this part about the interaction of equity and government. The special education, right? That's all from the federal bill. It's federally funded. It has their protocols and you have to stay in compliance, and essentially it's just become a checkbox. It's not something that schools have an incentive to do with fidelity, even though it was made with this notion to create more equity for different types of learners. But I do think that it brings back up that place where equity, as well-intentioned as it might be, when infused into this broad government program, it just undermines what it set out to do. All the regulation, the oversight, the compliance. I mean, IEPs have basically just become checkboxes. And a lot of this prepackaged curriculum just becomes like what Teacher Lady, what Portia said in our video a couple weeks ago, was it just creates packet pimps, right? Just this series of worksheets that culminates in an exam that you throw out into the garbage at the end, because what does it really mean to you? Like, these are just characteristics of really badly run organizations, which too often happens when you give government that job to do. I know she's not directly suggesting that some type of government initiative should be used to create more equity. In fact, that's what I really ultimately do like about this post, is it's all, again, about that teacher power. What are you doing as one teacher in one classroom to create this experience that is relevant and meaningful and impactful for your students? What are you doing to make what she calls these power shifts? Right? And again, I don't agree necessarily with all the language and the framing, but when it comes down to the bulk of the substance of what she's saying, man, I'm there. Let's do it. All right, let's finish off these tweets. Final one says,
if you are not intentionally shifting power, resources, or influence to marginalized people, you are not doing equity work in education. If you are not actively working against the status quo,
disrupt that status quo.
In schools, you are not doing equity work in education. Equity is about power.
So again, just to wrap things up here, I can nitpick about some of the language, but when I start looking past that and I look to the substance, when I look to the action, when I look to what she is saying that teachers should do to make it right, to, close these inequities, to make it more equitable, I'm on board. Like, let's go. Basically, what she's saying, you can use whatever language you want that makes you feel comfortable, that makes you feel validated, that makes you feel like you're doing the work that you set out to do. But basically, you need to use your position and your power as a teacher to empower others. And you already know class disruption is just that. It's about disrupting this status quo, right? Not just for disruption's sake, but just like you might see from a business or a marketplace, they come in, they disrupt, and they totally change up the game with a product, by adding value, not by looking to the government for some type of special program or special grant, but by creating that change that they want to see, and by providing more value than the system that already exists provides. So we need to get over this divide, this chasm that has been developing in the context of the society in general, right? The left versus the right, the Black Lives Matter versus Blue Lives Matter, or Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter. Like, why am I gonna stay here and yell back and forth with you? Like, what's the point? We need to get past that. We need to talk about substance. We need to talk about, okay, what does this actually look like in play, in action, in the classroom? This is not a zero-sum game. There is enough wealth and joy and freedom and opportunity and American dream for every single person in this country. Wealth is a team sport, and I want you on my team. So smash that like button. If you're new here and you haven't already gotten like this whole idea, I love your beautiful face. Hit that subscribe button and that bell so you get notified every time I drop a video. Drop me a comment in that section down below. What are you thinking about equity? How do you approach it? How do you see it playing out? What type of language do you like to use? And how can you push yourself outside of that box to connect with an individual who you might see as having a totally different perspective? Maybe you won't even think it's a legit perspective at all. I want you to find that common ground. So let me know again what you're doing, how you're making these conversations. If you want to have a conversation with me, come on here. We talk it out. We talk that talk. Let me know in those comments down below. You could DM me. I'm on Instagram at class.disruption. I'm on Twitter at classdisruption, except the O is a 0. You can hit me there. Those links are in the description down below. If you want to donate to my classroom, my kids are going to be doing some amazing things this year. You could donate using the links down below. I got PayPal, I got Cash App. Those links are also in the description down below. Check us out on Instagram at MakingHistoryEdmonds. I'm just trying to have a little fun here. I'm trying to stay foolish. And wait, that's how we end this thing off. You know what I need you to do? Stay foolish, y'all.